Well, here we are at the end of March, and this week the first phase of the reopening, the great reopening, began from lockdown number 3. So there's a lot of reflection going on amongst commentators, scientists, sociologists and the general public about what the legacy is going to be from the lockdowns that had their first anniversary just over a week ago. I have to say, I'm worried, perplexed. I'm not celebrating that this is the great reopening. There's too much that remains uncertain, despite the evidence that says that certainty shouldn't be in question. This time last year, everybody was really frightened. New virus, death rate, case fatality rate of, I think, was 3.4%, big number, meaning millions of people would die. And then the modelers were saying in the UK that 250,000 to 500,000 people would die. And also we had no idea who was vulnerable, even though it was a respiratory virus, and we should have had a good idea. But we didn't, general public didn't. It soon became apparent though that the people who were vulnerable were those who were elderly and frail, already had 2 or 3 what they call comorbidities. And the field data that emerged in the first couple of months, in contrast to the modelling, was saying that the people who were most at risk were those old people, and the median age was soon established to be around 82. Anyone below the age of 70 and 50 was soon regarded as at very, very low risk indeed, and children at no risk whatsoever, unless of course these people already were asthmatic, seriously obese, heart problems, diabetes and so on. And to go along with the statistics and the uncertainty is that the medical profession didn't know really how to treat it. But of course lots of things were tried, from putting people on ventilators at the beginning that were soon proven to be not the best solution, and patients were started to being prescribed steroids and other medication to help them overcome some of the breathing difficulties that were occurring. Anyway, the death rate soon began to plummet and pretty much flatlined throughout the summer, and then that first lockdown was kind of cautiously reopened and so on. And then we had mask mandates that came in July last year, along with the social distancing. And then as we know, all respiratory diseases started to return in the autumn. It wasn't long before we were having another lockdown in November, and then again in January. So throughout, quite a few people have been querying the medical evidence, the scientific evidence, the statistical evidence. And there's been a lot of questions that's been asked and continue to be asked about where this is leading us. So here we are at the end of March. Cases have been dropping. They're now more than 90% down in terms of deaths, hospitalizations and cases than they were just 2 months ago. So we really are moving into spring and summer now, where it's expected to flatline once again. We can kind of get back to normal, but even that's not certain. So where are we now? The end of March. What do we know? It's all people who die and get hospitalized. Everybody else has got a 99% chance of surviving. Confirmed case. I did a reckoner yesterday on a template in The Economist, and for someone my age, my chance of dying from coronavirus are 1.5%. I think the chances of me dying whilst out on the bike are even greater than that. We also know that the testing regime, the PCR test and the lateral flow test, the latter has false positives and false negatives, and the PCR test has false positives. And even just this week, Panorama on the BBC broadcast an expose of what was happening in the labs, I think the one in Milton Keynes, where there was cross-contamination of samples, rendering the statistical basis on which we're having these lockdowns somewhat unreliable, if not criminal. The government is still insisting on mask wearing in enclosed places. It introduced mask wearing in classrooms for teenagers at school 4 weeks ago. Didn't move the dial on the in terms of the number of hospitalizations, deaths and cases. So I'm hoping that that mask mandate will be dropped after the Easter holidays, which begins this weekend, which would be good. Because now more than 50% of the adult population have been vaccinated with one of the 2 vaccines currently available. There's a third coming on stream, the Moderna one's coming very shortly. And that there's several other million have had and recovered from coronavirus, including myself. Last year, I'm pretty certain now that I had all the symptoms of coronavirus last January and February. That resulted in me getting a scan at hospital. But I don't really suffer from colds and respiratory viruses very much at all, so I kind of got over it like most people do. But that kind of renders me immune, at least for a while. So we're expecting that basically what will happen over the summer, there'll be hardly any cases, hardly any hospitalizations or deaths, and the government's program for reopening the country will continue until June the 21st, when supposedly all restrictions will be off. We can kind of almost get back to normal, but not quite, because the government is talking about 2 things that are deeply concerning to me, and I'm sad to say only a small minority of people. And that one is that they're proposing to put the vaccines into children. The vaccine trials themselves don't complete until 2023, and there is no long-term safety or other health issue data available. Naturally, there won't be for several years. And it's being applied, the idea is going to be applied to children who are at no risk from dying of this disease. First, do no harm, I believe, is the Hippocratic Oath. But seemingly, the government is intent on vaccinating everyone, all adults, and then children come the autumn. The second issue is this notion of vaccine passports. Here we have this idea that's been emerging and has been already applied in Israel, is that in order to carry out your normal business, and we're not talking about international travel here, where there are some precedents for taking vaccinations before you travel to particular countries, like yellow fever if you go to Africa, malaria tablets and so on if you're going to the tropics. But the idea is that vaccine passports will be required in order to carry out your normal business, to go to the pub, to go to a concert or a restaurant or a theatre, maybe to work, to university, to school. And that is really a real problem. For a disease that doesn't affect effectively the working population. The working population who spend most of the money on leisure are required to have a vaccine they don't need in order to carry about their normal business. Now, I can understand if you've already had the vaccine, that you were concerned about it, you were worried because the government had been putting out information, some say propaganda, on how serious the illness was and how at risk the general population was. I can understand why people want to do it. They make their own personal calculation. But I make my own personal calculation as well, and everybody else has the right to do that. I think it's a founding principle really of a liberal democracy, is that it's about around the sanctity of the individual. There's also the Nuremberg Code that was followed the Second World War, where it was agreed in international law that a medical procedure could not be put upon an individual without their informed consent, whether that's deliberate or as a result of coercion of some sort. And I think that's where we are right now. If you already had the vaccine, there's this thing called the sunk cost fallacy, where people become wedded to the decisions that they've already made because they've already sunk cost, effort, money into doing it, into making that decision. And if, for example, the government was to come out right now and say, we've looked at all of the evidence once again, there is no risk to the working population, go about your business, vaccines are no longer required, I think there will be a significant portion of those people who've taken a vaccine who will be concerned and disappointed that they kind of went through with it when they were maybe primarily motivated by fear, rather than having a deep understanding of the pros and cons. So there is the sunk cost fallacy. So you now got the situation where the people who are the holdouts, the younger people who are yet to be offered a vaccine, but also the older people who have made their own personal risk assessment and they've decided they don't want to take the vaccine, at least not yet, is that you've now got social pressure beginning to emerge. And part of that social pressure is feeding into the idea that vaccine passports are genuinely going to be required. So yesterday I went out for a bike ride with a couple of really good friends of mine, both very smart, very experienced, very well educated. Both have had the vaccine. And one of them, I think, has got some historical asthma concerns, and you know, it's fine. And they're both in my age bracket, so around about 60 years old. So you kind of think, well, fair enough. But the subject, we began talking about vaccine passports, and I said I didn't like the idea because I thought it was discriminatory against people who, for their own reasons, don't want to take the vaccine, or just not right now. And to my surprise, they were both very vociferous in their approval or support for people requiring a vaccine passport to go to the pub. The idea of civil liberties, the idea of individual choice, the sanctity of the rights of the individual, didn't matter. Didn't matter. It was all about personal choice. You take your choice not to take the vaccine, can't go to the pub. We're in the middle of a bike ride, so it's kind of hard to have the debate, and didn't really sit down and think about how you would go about, or how I would go about responding to that. But you kind of have to ask the question of my friends, but actually it's not just them. I mean, it's most people. I think 62% of the people who have already been polled, I saw a survey this morning, poll results this morning, 62% support vaccine passports for going about your normal business. So there's a huge amount of support in the country. So I'm not criticizing my friends, but I'm thinking more about generally, what do people do who are resistant to taking the vaccine. That their personal risk assessment is good enough for them, but clearly not good enough for society or for the government. So you have to ask the question, if you follow the logic, you can't go to the pub. Fair enough. You can't go overseas on holiday without having a test or a vaccine passport. Fair enough. What about going to the shop for food? What about going to the theatre or an open air concert? What about doing any sort of group activity like sports? I would imagine there's a significant portion of the population who support vaccine passports would be okay with that idea, on the proviso that they'd already taken the leap and had the vaccine. But what if the logical extension to all of this is that people who haven't been vaccinated are not only unwelcome in society at large, in the community, but they're dissuaded or even prevented from leaving home? Now, no one's saying that at the present time. But the logical consequence of normalizing the idea that people need a medical procedure and official digital or other confirmation of that to present to anyone or a machine, anyone who wants to see that, the logical consequence is that you end up excluding people from society who at the beginning of 2020 would have expected to go about their normal business until they end up on their deathbed. And even people who are supportive of vaccine passports, the same population 15 years ago rejected the idea of identity cards that Tony Blair wanted to impose on the nation. Some of these people disapprove of photographic identification for people going into a voting booth. And certainly a huge number of these people didn't believe a word Boris Johnson and his government had to say when it came to Brexit only just over a year ago, but now seemingly believe everything the government tells them about the necessity of having vaccine passports to go about your day-to-day business. If we suggested this to people in 2019, in the summer of 2019, you would have been laughed at as totalitarian. So I'm no epidemiologist or scientist or statistician, but I am somewhat expert in the practice of negotiation and persuasion. It's what I've been doing professionally for the past 40 years almost. There's a theme in negotiation, there's a practice called conditioning, which is really about using persuasive methods to begin to plant a seed in the mind of the organization, person you're negotiating with, to begin to accept your version of reality. And what the government has been doing with all its persuasive messaging around coronavirus is straight from the conditioning playbook. And you know, this time last year I would have been fair enough, that's okay, there is a medical emergency on our hands, you've got to get people to sit up and take notice and then comply with whatever instructions are deemed to be the best and most effective. But we're not in that medical emergency anymore. Not with, they reckon, well over half the population, the total population, now carrying antibodies and protection against this illness, COVID-19. So the skeptics amongst us kind of wondering where this is going to lead. When, if you really sat people down and said to them, explained all the costs and benefits, pros and cons, and the consequences of fundamentally change the way we have a relationship with the state and with owners of hospitality venues, would they be happy to carry a vaccine passport, or would they wish instead to go about the business as they expected to back in 2019? I would bet most people would want to live normally as they would have expected to in 2019 and well beyond. Oh, it's a climb out of Lichfield. I think something that people aren't really thinking about yet is that if vaccine passports come in the way I've been describing, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to lose a lot of friends. I think it'll start where the groupthink will put pressure on everyone to have the vaccine, to comply, which is kind of understandable, as I've explained. And then what will happen is that people will have a couple of experiences where one of their friends is unable to do something, can't go to a concert, can't go to the pub, is refused entry to a restaurant, and then people will stop inviting them, and then friendships will break down. So given that a medical procedure is a private, personal matter, and has always been accepted as such, the idea now that normal citizens are going to start making judgments on other people based upon what medical procedure they've had is something we would never have contemplated in 2019 or earlier. So I think we'll have to wait and see to what extent the government is going to push this, but it seems very keen to do so. It's already spent about £500,000 and a number of contracts that were awarded towards the end of last year to tech firms for feasibility studies and tech development. And now that there are working models in Israel and it's being talked about elsewhere, then I'd say it's about 70%, 75% chance that that is what is going to be implemented here in the UK. We're going to be living in a very different world, even though I have to say, as somebody who's kind of recently retired and living a relatively simple life, I did expect that I'd be going to restaurants and concerts and the theatre and sporting events just as normal. So I might get the vaccine yet. I just want to wait. The conversation I had with my GP was that I'm low risk. The prevalence of the virus is falling as spring and summer comes along. I'd like to wait until next autumn before I make my decision. Might be an easy decision by then, but I might still be a holdout with all the consequences that will result in. Who knows? Who knows? Strange times though, eh? Strange times. So to sum up, these are strange, difficult times. Sure, if you want to follow the herd, do what you're told, Believe everything the government says, even if you disbelieve them during Brexit. Fill your boots, do it. But please don't judge others who are more reticent, perhaps independent, I don't know. That's for others to judge. I just want to live a normal life. I don't want any medical procedure. I want no more than I choose to have. And I've had a few, so I know what it's like.